Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook, and support me on local. Subscribe, star, and buy me a coffee. And from Buy Me a Coffee, I've got quite a few recent, rather substantial donations, so thank you for those who do that. Thank you for your continued support. Such support is necessary to keep the show going. So, the first thing we're going to talk about today is what is it to be a man? So, there's quite a few books out there that have been written by Harvey Mansfield, which I think is Manliness, Jack Donovan's The Way of Men. You've got also Anthony Esolen, I think it's called No Apologies. And then you have various, not so much books, but for example, Jordan Peterson and other online intellectuals who talk about this as well. Brett McKay, The Art of Manliness. And obviously, don't need to tell anyone here that there is a crisis in the definition of what is a man. And these are what we might call positive male identities trying to be constructed by these other writers. But what I find is that they all ultimately fall short. Now, they all have somewhat slightly different focuses than each other, but they sort of all engage on the fact that they define man by what he does, not by what he is. So, for example, the one that I read probably over 10 years ago, The Way of Men by Jack Donovan, he talks about the idea of primarily mastery, which is man's ability to exercise, control, and influence over something external to himself. Land, other men, animals, some tool or instrument that he's mastered. And he wants to make a distinction between being good at being a man and being a good man. He says, being good at being a man is exercising mastery, and being a good man is living up to whatever social norms or values that your community has. And he says those are not the same thing. I'll have a little bit more to say on that later. The idea that a man is what he does, obviously that's central to Jack Donovan's position, but it's also central to other positions. For example, Anthony Esolen in his, which I've not finished, but his No Apologies, he talks about men building cities, building infrastructure, building technology, doing things like that, as well as fighting with each other, both in ritualized things like sports or the playground or actual warfare to protect women and children. Jordan Peterson seems to want to see most of this in terms of man working in the economy. Man needs to, for example, say this 5-year plan, you just do something within the American system, and allegedly it's supposed to work out, right? So, and then there's a whole gamut of material that you'll find with Brett McKay. He covers all sorts of things, ranging from, historical examples, quote unquote, of manly men to fashion to fitness to all sorts of other things. I mean, I guess we could also include the red pill in this too, but they tend to be a little more narrow and don't spend as much time defining what man is, but rather how you should take advantage of the situation today or hedge PUAs or hedge against any possible damage. That would be MRAs and MGTOW. But again, if you define a thing by what it does and not what it is, you have a problem. Have you really defined the thing in any meaningful sense? Because one could easily imagine two machines that both are meant to do the same thing. And if you define them by what they do rather than what they are, the differences were going to be negligible, just, means, not ends. And you might not get to the underlying deep structure of it. And the same would be for a man. If man is just defined by what he does, sort of reduces him to a machine. So this is sort of where we're at. And there seems to be a inability for these writers, authors, podcasters, YouTubers, whatever, to really fulfill this. Sometimes man is defined in relation to being different than women and children, being bigger, faster, stronger, more intelligent, all the things that used to be taken for granted in the past. This is entirely remedial. Many of these manliness accounts deal with that. And as far as it goes, that's fine, because we're so far behind the 8 ball, we have to do that much remediation. So, but that doesn't really describe what a man is. What I would say as a working general principle, this is not going to be overly theological. This is mostly just going to be a what you could say would have been understood or conceptualized by the entire Western tradition. Aristotle's definition of man as a rational animal. Like an animal, man has a body with physical needs, food, sleep, drink, things like that. But also, unlike animals, he has reason, this ability to think and to solve problems and to reflect on the nature of existence itself. And that's really key for Aristotle, is that man has this rational faculty which separates him from the animals. And the only people today that really talk about that are libertarians and objectivists, but I have a whole set of other objections to them, but at least they're starting with the fact that man is rational. And that's not a surprise, because Ayn Rand was indebted to Aristotle to some degree, but they have other assumptions that muddy it, and that's also a definition of man embedded in a larger philosophy about freedom and the economy and so on, whereas this is more narrow than that. We're just going to deal with what is a man. And so if we talk about what a man does and then man's mastery over other things, because I think Jack Donovan, even though other authors don't necessarily interact with him, he is outlining a certain rubric or heuristic or mindset that we see with these other authors. And the idea that I want to challenge, and I've challenged this before in other places, is that a good man is different from being good at being a man, right? Because if being good at being a man is to exercise mastery, both in his, so what a man does, in his sense, and in the others, Jordan Peterson, Anthony Esolen, and Harvey Mansfield, and Brett McKay, it's all external to man, right? It's man relating to things outside of himself, not man relating to himself. And of course, with the classical conception of the virtues, it is a man is virtuous or moral or ethical or good when he acquires mastery over himself. And this is just a very strange place to be, the idea that you would never take this logic of mastery and then apply it to the self, unless for some a priori reason you're excluding the self as a possibility, which might be the case, because, for example, Jordan Peterson says that man is just a chimpanzee full of snakes, which sounds a lot like Hume's bundle of impressions. That's just a very bad philosophical construction of mind. I mean, after all, if it's just a bundle of impressions, what exactly preserves an identity over time? What exactly filters the information that we receive through our senses in order to then, one, not have to deal with information overload, but then also two, to be able to sort that knowledge out and then use it, right? That's where sort of Kant steps in and says, well, Hume just completely is inadequate on this. But unfortunately, Kant's theory of mind and our ability to gain knowledge is not what is prevalent. It's actually Hume. And I think that's implicitly what's going on with a lot of these writers. They may not say that directly, but the way they treat the self, the soul, man's inner parts, his psychology, is very anemic at best. And to the extent reason is invoked, it's usually reason in service of either A, the passions, as Hume said again, Hume's long reach, or it's the idea that man uses his reason to solve some external problem, to do something. Okay, well, the thing is, though, if you view the self or the psychology as a kind of like inner vacuum, then man is just kind of like a shadow or an automaton. It's not actually man. And so what I would argue is that there is no distinction between being good at being a man and being a good man, because if being good at being a man is exercising mastery over things, then the first thing you obviously should exercise mastery over is self. So therefore, being a good man is a necessary outgrowth of being good at being a man. And given that acquiring mastery over things follows the same pattern of progression, if you start with yourself, you gain two advantages. You learn the process, you learn how to acquire mastery, and then you are putting yourself in a position where you're better able to learn new things in the first place. So, I mean, for example, if we look at this sort of, not dealing with the ethical or not dealing with the moral and just sort of leaving it as an abstracta. I mean, can you be a good soldier if you're at your sentry and you're drunk? Well, of course not. Drunkenness is a moral vice, and that impairs your ability to do your job. And so you can't really separate the two. That's ultimately the problem. And so that's just sort of setting up what I think is inadequate and unhelpful. And we haven't really moved a whole lot. I think Mansfield book was like 2005. So it's been like 20 years, not a lot I think has been constructive here. And we're asking a lot of the same questions. So I've already started by saying that man is a rational animal. And so that means, again, he has properties like an animal, a physical body. He has physical appetites related to that body, but unlike animals, he has reason. So a good example would be the FPP, first person perspective. If an animal looks at itself in the mirror, it becomes defensive and thinks that another animal is encroaching in on its territory, rather than just it being a reflection of itself, which a human intuitively knows, a man intuitively knows at a certain point. Okay, at a certain point, he knows that. That's one practical aspect of how man's reason is fundamentally separates him from the animals in a quantitative, not a qualitative way. It's just no animal has anything like that. And so, starting with that, and then going from there to extending mastery over self, we can then use the classical virtues, the four classical virtues of prudence, justice, courage, temperance. Prudence is doing the right thing at the right time for the right reason, and according to Aristotle, is the unifying principle of all the other virtues. To be just, courageous, or prudent, or temperate, you have to achieve what's called the golden mean between the excess and the deficiency. So let's use courage as an example. The excess is rashness, and the deficiency is cowardice. Also, excess is better than deficiency because you have too much of something, so you can always sort of dial it back in theory, whereas the defect means you don't even have it. You have to actually acquire it. So that's actually a bit harder than just dialing back the excess. So the excess is less bad, but still bad. Now, using his reason, his mind, he's then able to learn through habit and education and instruction, prudence, and then practice applying it in various stages of life. So that's where we can start by saying that man is a good man. The other thing I wanted to say to back up briefly to the preamble to all this is this idea that man doesn't have an inner self and that we don't define man by what he is rather than by what he does is, I think, a result of Enlightenment epistemology. Aristotle defines four causes: material, efficient, formal, and final. So you can imagine a chair. The material cause of the chair is wood. The efficient cause of the chair is the artisan. The formal cause of the chair is the chairness in which it participates in, that abstract quality of being a chair that all chairs share in. And then the final cause to be sat in. Well, beginning with Locke and the idea that the only sort of valid source of information we have is through the senses, formal and final causes were removed. So that kind of takes an axe to the idea of what man is. Even people who are Christian and were Catholic, who you'd think would still believe in these principles and would say that they do, in practice don't start there. Again, I mentioned Anthony Esolen, who is Catholic, and his book No Apologies. He doesn't seem to start there. So that's a problem. And then also we have Kant, who says that, the noumenal realm, which might exist, which does exist, can't know much about it. And that just happens to be where formal and final causes are. So these are just Enlightenment assumptions that are sort of muddying the water of epistemology. So going back to that, we can then look at how focusing on man's things that he does can be problematic, because all of these guys talk about mostly with regards to some sort of physical activity. Whereas if we view man as a rational animal, man is most like himself when he uses his mind. That can be done in a completely abstract way, like music, philosophy, poetry, or it can be used in achieving some goal, whether that be self-mastery or mastery of something external to himself. So in that regard, man using his reason is what makes man man and more than an animal. And so when you focus on a man's ability to take mastery over territory or procreate or eat or produce some surplus, I mean, animals do that. Animals procreate, animals eat, animals mark out territory. Obviously, man can do it at a far more sophisticated level because he has all of these other traits that they don't have. But nonetheless, you're not focusing on the thing that makes man unique. Now, again, he might do it in a more complex way than an animal because he does have reason, but that's not what makes him unique. Animals don't write poetry. Animals don't do philosophy. Animals don't do science. All of these things are what men do. And so that's what distinguishes man from the animals. The other thing, too, is oftentimes nowadays, because of the confusion of the gender roles, man is defined vis-a-vis against women or children, whereas historically man was defined either vis-a-vis against animals or against spiritual beings like angels and God. Aristotle said that only animals and gods can be solitary, man must live in community. So with that in mind, we can see also that lacking a broader metaphysical framework in which to place man creates a difficulty in even defining him. Because, if you define, because we can say man as the male of the biological sex of men, or you could say, women and children, which they fall within the category of man as a class of being, but they're the either female or sex or the juvenile form of. Well, the thing is, you don't define, the biological man in relationship to them first. You define him in relationship to the other things out there. Some people may not believe in angels and God, but you can still define him in terms of animals. And that's sort of where Aristotle starts. He takes a more of a pragmatic position. And so then this leads to other problems and complications, right? Because now we have this tension, right? If we take the idea that if we define man by what he is, not by what he does, we come to a different conclusion. Rather than the modern emphasis on competition, men competing with other men, either in sports or business or war or whatever, in order to achieve status, we realize that rather man should be cooperative. Aristotle says that man is meant to live in a society. He cannot live on his own like an animal or a god. And so that ends up radically changing and altering that relationship between man to other men. It creates the idea of fraternity, the polis, as Aristotle said, the friendship which links men together so they can form communities and polises. Whereas that's completely gone. I mean, some of the older authors like, Harvey Mansfield might talk about friendship, or Esolen, they're older. But you don't find that as much, especially with the younger guys who talk about this. That's crucial to understanding a fully formed identity of who man is, how he relates to other men, more specifically in terms of alliances and cooperation, and family and friends, which is just all left out. Now, ultimately, what this does is it ends up serving purposes other than man's purpose. Because if you're always in competition with each other, what does that do? Well, competition creates a downward pressure on wages. So you end up reducing the cost of labor, because if we see in the historical record of the United States, wages go up when you organize and strike and have unions advocate for higher wages. Waiting for the best wishes of the boss, it's never going to happen. So now, I'm not saying that all of these guys are intentionally trying to depress wages, but this idea of philosophical individualism, which is anathema to any concept of man, if you look at man by defining him by his nature, what he is, as we do with Aristotle, because man is supposed to be in community, creates this downward pressure on men that they can't succeed, because they should be working together and forming communities, not competing with each other for these superficial status markers, which in the end just dissipate anyhow. So that's one thing that would be, quote, corrected for if we did this. We would say, well, no, we wouldn't be competing with each other for these positions. We would be working together to improve our bargaining power and our basis of action for getting these positions. So that's one. Two, there's sort of a continuum fallacy where you go from tools to modern technology. I've already mentioned this before in other places, the three distinctions of tools from Ivan Illich. I'll just briefly list them, and you can watch other videos for the more detail. Organon, distal, and systems. What ends up happening is by defining a man by what he does, and then specifically tying that to the use of modern technology, you end up hollowing out man. Man gives up of himself so that he isn't actually even able to act anymore, right? He only acts in a mediated sense through the technology itself. So let me give you an example, right? I mentioned in a previous video a couple weeks ago about Tolkien's view of magic, elf magic, and Mordor magic. Elf magic is developing inner properties, cultivating inner skills. Mordor magic is using some external force to bulldoze other people. Now, we can make a distinction between someone who is truly of the aristocratic class because he has mastered certain arts and practices, rather than some, degenerate, decayed line where merely because they have the title and the clothes and the property, they think that they're, quote, aristocrats. You take the degenerated form out of his position and put him somewhere else in society, and he's useless. He can't do anything because he's his whole life he's been pampered by the court, so he has no capacity on his own. Whereas, think of the Greek heroes, right? Ulysses was a king, but he had inherent capacities in himself, so that even whilst he had no kingdom and no army, he was still a formidable individual because he had cultivated these individual skills and traits. That has been completely eroded by this conception of man acting. It's almost a kind of existentialism, which is really weird because that's often associated with the left, Sartre and Camus, whereas, just act, just exercise the will, though I guess there's an implicit existentialism of fascism, but many of these authors would also reject fascism, where men are just supposed to act for the sake of acting, either for the sake of corporations or for the state, dying in war or dying to protect women. It's never for his own interest, right? He's never supposed to do something for his own interest, but always at the expense of someone else. But then this creates the paradox of, so when you're on an airplane and it's crashing, they say first put on a mask on yourself, because if you don't protect yourself first, you can't then help other people. So there's this sort of deficit in telling men how to best protect and preserve themselves. I guess you could say the RP is a little bit better there, but it's almost entirely CYA stuff, not actually stuff that's going to have you build capacity to act outside of the limits and paradigms of the world we live in. So I think that's a problem there as well. And so ultimately, by overemphasizing man's ability to act externally, these authors have, whether they know it or not, because modern technology hollows out man's ability to act, created a context in which man loses that ability to act. It's very paradoxical. And I mentioned this before as well, though this is not directly within the context of what it is to be a man, but for example, the idea of a power process that Ted Kaczynski talks about, he speaks about it in primarily materialistic terms, the ability to do some work out there in the world physically that's meaningful, which is important. I agree. That's why I'm a fan of his position. But this idea that you could build an inner life, an inner reality that can then be satisfying on its own terms is something that these authors completely leave out, which is not something that you would have seen as a deficit or a limit or a defect in prior ages. So as a brief citation from Walden by Henry David Thoreau, we see the importance of developing an inner life. This is a small portion from his conclusion. What does the West stand for? Is it not our interior white on the chart? Black though it may prove. Like the coast, when discovered, it is the source of the Nile or the Niger or the Mississippi or the Northwest Passage around this continent that we would find. Are these the problems which most concern mankind? Is Franklin the only man who is lost, that his wife should be so earnest to find him? Does Mr. Ginnell know where he himself is? Be rather the Mungo Park, the Lewis and Clark, and the Frobisher of your own streams and oceans. Explore your own inner latitudes with shiploads of preserved meat to support you, if they be necessary, and pile the empty cans sky high for a sign. Where preserved meats invented merely to preserve meat. Nay, be a Columbus to whole new continents or worlds within you. Open new channels, not of trade, but of thought. Every man is the lord of a realm, besides which the earthly empire of the czar is but a petty state, a hammock left by the ice. Yet some can be patriotic who have no self-respect and sacrifice the greater to the less. They love the soil which makes their graves, but have no sympathy for the spirit which may still inmate their clay. So there we go. I'll just leave it there because he keeps on going. But the point is that there's this inner quality. And again, this inner quality is left out again and again and again by all of these authors. Part of it is, I think, they don't have it themselves. There's an axiom: you cannot give what you do not possess. So if they do not possess it, then they can't give it. So that seems to be the most likely option. I mean, to argue that they'd all be in a conspiracy to suppress that seems somewhat unlikely, especially since they're trying to give a positive definition of manhood. It would be a little easier to believe in a conspiracy if it were like hostile feminists or something, but I don't think so. I don't think that's ultimately the motivating factor. So this inner life isn't being cultivated. This idea of forethought and planning is not they might talk about planning in terms of a specific mission or a task, but not as a part of a life goal, like planning your life ahead. I guess Jordan Peterson talks about that a little bit, but it's very materialistic in its terms, like his 5-year plan. And so, what this I think really amounts to is that we live in this techno-capital system that Nick Land talks about, and it really just sort of turns men into machines, cogs for the machine, wage slaves for the economy, and conscript cannon fodder for the military. Right? I mean, all these things are just assumed to be unalloyed goods that you just need to do. I'm like, why? Like in any other human civilization, all of these things would have been up for discussion. Some would have said yes, some would have said no. It depended on the time. So now, maybe again, they themselves are so embedded in these systems that they just don't see it. But because here's the thing, right? If you have a definition of man by what he does, and what he does is do all these hard and dangerous things that are life-threatening and risky, that are actually endangering to him with increasingly limited returns, this is actually a bad definition of manhood because it's just setting so many men up to fall. And it's in relation to these changing material realities outside of him that, for example, if they were to go away, would leave him without a definition. So this is the problem. That's what I call it. It's what I call the falling on the sword element, where they just want men to fall on their sword. Another good example would be so you might talk about planning ahead, like Jordan Peterson's 5-year plan, but you don't talk about prudence. So, for example, there's this sort of like white knighting you'll see with a lot of these authors that, men are just there to save women. Well, the first thing you need to ask is, well, no, how did she get into trouble in the first place? Maybe it's not, she needs to learn those hard knocks, and it's not your job to save her, because by quote unquote sheltering her from the effects of her bad behavior, you create a vicious cycle. I mean, the idea that you just see something that needs done, someone who's in trouble, or quote some task that allegedly needs to be done, and they don't even ask, well, how did these realities come to be, and do they really need my assistance to get involved? I mean, that's the use of prudence. Is this the right time? Is this the right reason? Is this the right cause? They don't really talk about that, and it's like, well, going back to energy and Eroy and all that other stuff, all of these, any action a man takes is going to expend energy, and he better get more back, otherwise it's an energy sink. And by what this does effectively is taps men out by having them in these energy sinks. And so it kind of leaves them caught in a web that they can't see. So then how do we deal with this? Well, Going back to the definition of man as a rational animal, a good man is a man who takes mastery over himself. And again, this is a broadly, philosophical definition, broadly secular, not necessarily uniquely Christian, though a Christian could accept this. We see that even absent material space to achieve power process, you could do it internally. And by doing it internally, you might then therefore create the conditions by altering how you relate to reality, which is what Nick Lane calls hyperstition, to create a new reality that's more suited to your needs and your desires. And so the good man in this context, or the man in this context, would begin by looking at each choice that he has to make and then evaluating them based on prudence. Since there's only so many choices in a day he can make, he has to determine, okay, well, which of these are good causes to go in or not, and which benefit me in the long run, and of course, more generally, society in the long run. And all what that means is, in part, restraining himself vis-a-vis his wants, his desires, and his appetites. Whereas, because again, what you oftentimes can control is your external circumstances. Most cases you can't. What you can control is yourself. So if you want to minimize negative externalities and have a positive EROI, then doing all of that will put you in a position where you're better able to see things as they are. So, for example, a good example of this would be the Miyazaki film, Princess Mononoke, where Princess Hitaka sees the world without hate. But everybody else is full of hate or greed, and they can't see the picture clearly, so they do very disastrous things. Whereas Ashitaka, because he has self-mastery, he's a good man, he can see things as they are and therefore make clear actions that will be useful for himself and for others. So there's that aspect, which would then help not only him, right? He's putting on the mask now on the airplane. He can then help other people too. Because, right, if a man is constantly running from his own demons and his own debt collectors, he can't really be much use to anyone else. Now, with prudence, doing the right thing for the right reasons, there is some challenge to that today. One is the complexity of society, and two is the lack of self-understanding. We live in the modern technological society in which, at least up until the lockdowns of 2020, 2021, we were in Toffler's future shock, where the material conditions changed so rapidly that it became almost impossible to meaningfully plan ahead. And so people writing within that framework are probably going to be like, well, we're not going to spend a lot of time on planning ahead. The only way you could possibly plan ahead in that context would be to appeal to the perennial principles that are true in all times and all places. So to use C.S. Lewis's Aslan would be the deep magic that undergirds reality, and then the machine and modern technology would be sort of like the magic that only Queen Jadis the witch knew. And then also lack of self-understanding. It's difficult to plan ahead if you don't know yourself, which is why the philosophical school of Socrates said, know thyself. That's where it starts. And again, this is what's so frustrating, is this has been the Western tradition for over 2,000 years. And the fact that we have apparently forgotten this. I think Harvey Mansfield and Anthony Esolen certainly know of these authors. Some of the others, like Jack Donovan or Harvey Mansfield or Brett McCabe, maybe no. But some of the older ones certainly do, and yet they don't start with know thyself, which is what the entire Western philosophical tradition starts with. So, to me, that's, I think, very problematic. And now we could say that a good man, now using the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which is a outgrowth of the sociability of man, as Aristotle states, and gaining self-mastery through self-knowledge. Those two together then lead to the golden rule, which then says, okay, well, how do we treat other people about us? Well, the first thing is he wouldn't do favors for the rich or powerful because, one, they can either bribe or coerce people to do it for them, and they're oftentimes getting in his way. I mean, a good example would be like how Hercules, the hero, overthrows the tyrant Diomedes of Thrace and his flesh-eating horses by feeding him to the horses. It's like this, this guy. If the rich and the powerful trust in what they have, riches and money, which means they don't trust in friends, right? They're antisocial. They're not sociable. So then he would then not necessarily be hostile to them, but not be bending over backwards to comply with them. He would instead be trying to find friends and help build them up, and the deserving poor, right? This is where prudence comes in. If somebody's down on their luck through no fault of their own versus someone who's a chronic vicious person, you have to be able to tell the difference and then use your abilities to help what we would call the deserving poor, to bring him up to your level or the capacity to be at your level. Because again, if you live in society, you have the people you can trust. And without going into the whole detail of friendship, as I've already dealt with before, Aristotle speaks of 3 levels: utility, pleasure, and good. And a good friend is both useful and pleasurable, but you share the same love of the good. So he helps bring other people up to that level of friendship with him so that he can have a society to live in. Now, this sort of like highest tier friendship, we could say, is the where equality can exist. In the classical world, equality meant that you all graduated at the same level. So in Sparta, the warrior caste was called the homoioi, the equals. Why? Because they all graduated the agoge and were all competent to fight Sparta's wars. But in this case, the equality we're speaking of is the equality of goodness, which is the measure of mastery the man has over himself. He would also, not be gullible or be taken in. He would be, quote, shrewd as a serpent, and advocate for his benefit and, by extension, others who are good like him. Now, there's, I guess, another category would be the neutral people that just are not really your enemies and not really your friends. They're just kind of there. Well, you don't need to write a check that he can't pay, so he would treat, them with the respect and distance necessary to at least not make them enemies. So in that right, so extending from all of this, antisocial behavior would be discouraged. The good man wouldn't be antisocial. A good man realizes that he also once shared in the vices of others, right? He can empathize with the fact that other people who are not at his level of enlightenment he was once like them. And so he can then use that and draw in from himself to help lift them up. To avoid conflict and to build a community, because again, man lives in community. He's not a god or an animal. And then to do that and to hedge against potential future disaster, he needs to use his reason. And a precondition for all of that is, quote, the level of goodness, which is measured by the level of mastery he has over himself, which is acquired by habituating yourself to the 4 cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, temperance, and courage. Okay, so that's how I would define a man, and also just pointing out how I feel like a lot of these other authors are not really helpful in that regard. We have a few comments from Alone in the Woods. Alone in the Woods seems like after a man masters things, he would then move on to systems. Yes. Philosophy, yeah. Unfortunately, the whole has been broken. Still alone in the woods. 40% of millennials, men have no friends. Let that sink in. Yep. Money doesn't make a man. Correct. Let's see. Sacrifice for the sake of it. Yeah. Wandering Panda. Ashitaka is great. Well, again, Wandering Panda. I call him the Theodred of the East. Yeah, nice. All right, everybody. That's all I have for tonight. Thank you for tuning in. is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off.